Welcome to Get Sleepy, the podcast where we listen, we relax, and we get sleepy. I'm Thomas. Thank you for tuning in. It's so great to have you here with me. I'm hoping that tonight's story will add a bit of colour to the darker days that many of us are adjusting to right now. We'll take a journey through the charming history of one of the world's most beloved colouring toys. So now we're nearly ready to start our story. To get in just the right mindset, close your eyes and simply picture a plain piece of paper. Its surface is white, with no smudges or marks. It's a blank canvas for your creativity. The paper is laying flat on a sturdy wooden table, which is the perfect height for you to comfortably rest your arms. Beside the paper is a thin cardboard box. If you pick up the box and shake it lightly, you can hear several objects rattling inside. Open the flap at the top. There, packed in tight rows, is a set of brand new crayons. Red, blue, yellow, green, and purple. Their tips are untouched and shiny, ready to make the first line of whatever you choose to draw. When you open the box, you are greeted by a familiar smell. A deep, waxy aroma that brings you back to some of your most precious memories and the joy of colouring on a brand new page. There's nothing quite like laying all of the colours out and deciding which one to start with. This is where we begin our story, in our imagination, where anything is possible. The crayons' exact origins are not entirely clear, but history shows us that in many ways, crayons and things like them were invented and reinvented many times over. Indeed, humans have used coloured implements to illustrate their imaginations for thousands of years. Nowadays, we often associate crayons with children, but their predecessors were often used by academics, artists, and writers to bring to life their vivid ideas. One of the earliest examples of using wax to create art is encaustic or hot wax painting, which first emerged in ancient Egypt and Greece. Wax is both versatile and resilient, allowing artists to create images on stone, wood, or canvas. Artists would place plain beeswax in a bowl and gently heat it over an open flame. Then, they would pour in dried pigments or powdered colours made from berries, flowers, and other natural ingredients. As the wax melted, the granules of colour sank and fused together during the mixing process. But if this paint-like solution cooled, it would be too hard to use. So, while it was still warm, the artist would daub it across a surface and shape it with brushes and small metal tools. The Romans took this style of encaustic painting and introduced it to all the corners of their expansive empire. Artists used the method to create highly detailed images of their leaders and gods. Even today, thousands of years after it was first invented, artists are still combining hot wax and colours to make malleable paints. In the 13th century, artisans in Europe began to experiment with new materials for writing and etching. They found that they were able to draw more easily on parchment and other forms of early paper by mixing sticks of black charcoal with oils. Over time, the oils were replaced with beeswax, which had much better binding properties. The other advantage of wax was that it could be combined with pigments. These creations are the ancestors of the crayons we know today. Somewhere around the 15th century, chalk-based pastels appeared. By mixing chalk and pigments into solid sticks, artists and writers were able to sketch with much more detail. Leonardo da Vinci famously used pastels to etch many of his famous diagrams, including concepts for a powered cart and a robotic knight. Pastels later made their way to England and France, where a variety of new pigments were used in the mixture. This meant that they could be made in an exciting array of different colours. And it was in Paris that the roots of the modern crayon truly took hold. In 1755, Nicolas Jacques Conté was born in a picturesque French commune close to the River Orne. Conté was a precocious child who was drawn to the arts and sciences. At 14, he began working as a professional painter, while also following his passion for the mechanical sciences. As an adult, Conté found himself serving as an officer in the army during the French Revolution. By that time, his technical prowess and artistic skill were common knowledge among the troops. Before the invention of pens, the humble pencil was a more practical alternative to quills and ink fountains, especially for use in the field. They were made from flat wood and a length of plumbago, a natural form of graphite found in England. These pencils were often used by soldiers to write communications, note supplies, and more. During the course of the war, France found itself cut off from its supply of plumbago. Without more, it would be impossible to make any new pencils. So, Conté was given the task of coming up with an alternative. Ever the innovator, he got to work, experimenting with possible substitutes. After a few days, Conté came up with an intriguing solution. He mixed graphite, water, and clay, and then pressed the mixture between two slivers of wood. He then baked the pencil until the synthetic lead was rigid. When Conte presented his invention to his superiors, it was an immediate success. And so it was, in 1795, Conte received a patent for his pencil. He later established a company to further develop his design. He added the option for various gradients, or a range of shades for the graphite. They could be lighter or darker, depending on preference. He also added pigments to the mixture, and the coloured pencil was born. He continued to experiment, and eventually designed a waxy pastel stick which came in an array of colours. A few years later, France honoured Conte with distinction for his crayons of various colours. Napoleon Bonaparte himself praised the inventor's ability to create anything from almost nothing. The Conte crayon has remained an artist favourite for well over 200 years. But today, it is the Crayola crayon that claims the spotlight in classrooms worldwide. And just like Conte, Crayola has a very interesting history. In 1836, Joseph Walker Binney was born in Wakefield, Yorkshire, in the north of England. Wakefield is a picturesque market town, centred around a tall cathedral and surrounded by wide green fields. When Joseph was young, it was a thriving hub of trade, attracting farmers and merchants from across the region. It's impossible to know for sure, but you can imagine a young Joseph drawing inspiration from a walk through his hometown's busy streets. There, he saw people bartering over thick bales of cloud-like wool and sacks of golden corn. At 18, Joseph served as an officer in Queen Victoria's army. He fought in Eastern Europe during the Crimean War. Eventually, he returned to England, where he found himself hankering for more adventure. And so, he crossed the Atlantic Ocean, bound for New York City. There, he was determined to start a whole new life. In bustling New York, Joseph found himself trying all manner of careers. He tried working as a realtor and as a pattern maker, designing metal casts for manufacturers. But none of it panned out. Eventually, he moved to Peekskill, a small town about 40 miles outside of New York. He and his wife started a family, and it was there he acquired an old tobacco factory, which would become the key to their fortune. In 1864, Joseph opened the doors to the Peekskill Chemical Works. Little did he know that it was the precursor to what would eventually become Crayola. Years later, his company would be producing crayons in all the colours of the rainbow for children worldwide. But at the time, Peekskill Chemical was not in the business of making crayons just yet. Instead, they focused on industrial pigments. The mid to late 1800s was a pivotal time for industry across America, and nowhere was that more true than in New York. The city was considered the factory of the world. It was perfectly situated near the Atlantic, which was the gateway to commerce. Yet its shoreline was protected by Long Island, which allowed for rows of docks. From the bottom of Manhattan, running up both sides, long wooden piers splayed out into the East River and the Hudson. Ships brought in raw materials from across the world, and factories made everything from clothing to carriage wheels, grand pianos to books. And one thing they all needed was colour. As manufacturing increased, companies began to standardize their products. They all wanted paint and dye in specific shades, so that everything they made would look the same. Joseph's plant initially focused on grinding and packaging hardwood charcoal and producing carbon black. This shade was often referred to as lamp black, for use in printer's ink, and it was the colour responsible for his company's nickname, Binney's Lamp Black Factory. To make the pigments, he and his team would burn wood charcoal, oil, fats, and metal oxides in a large furnace. The remnants from each burning session would be filtered into a fine powder and bagged up into large sacks. From there, they would make their way by horse and buggy to manufacturing facilities all over. As Joseph's business grew, so did his family. He and Annie had a son, Edwin, who showed a keen interest in his father's line of work. By the time Edwin was older, it was clear he would be joining Joseph at the factory. Edwin was fascinated by how one material, through a chemical process, could be transformed into something quite different. Soon, he was experimenting with other compounds and using them to create new colours and materials. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, Edwin's cousin, C. Harold Smith, was making his own plans to travel to New York. Harold was born in London in 1860. Even back then, London was a big, noisy place. Large factories were separated by thin, cobbled streets, and tall brick chimneys pumped out sooty clouds, blanketing the city in a thick, heavy smog. When he was a teenager, his family moved to far-off New Zealand, a land of snow-capped mountains and rolling green fields. But Harold saw his future in the United States, so he too travelled by ship to New York. Although we can't know for sure how Harold felt about the weeks-long journey, it must have been quite the adventure. you can imagine a young man standing at the side of the boat as it sailed through drifting waves. Maybe he saw a pod of dolphins in the distance, skimming through the water. With a journey as long as his, Harold probably saw at least one whale. Its huge tail breaking the surface, only to crash down heavily once more with a splash. Whatever the trip was like for Harold, one thing is certain. New York was very different from the New Zealand he had left behind. The city was a busy place, growing fast and always on the move. The shoreline welcomed cargo ships on a daily basis, and horses pulled heavy carts through the cobblestone streets. All around, thousands of voices made up the soundtrack of the city. People from across the world, speaking in countless different languages. Harold joined his uncle's business at its newly opened office in the heart of the city. Joseph quickly put his nephew to work as a travelling salesman for Binney's lampblack factory. As Edwin worked on methods for making carbon black, Harold travelled the country, meeting people and building relationships with new customers. Around 1885, Joseph handed over Binney's lampblack factory to the two young men. It was up to them to build a future for it. Shortly thereafter, they rebranded as the Binney and Smith Company. Together, they took their work to new heights. The combustion engine had been invented just a decade earlier. Naturally, there was a lot of buzz about the new motor car. Not wanting to be left out of the action, Binney and Smith began to supply black pigment to the car tyre industry. They also found success selling shoe polish. At the turn of the 20th century, they purchased an old grist mill in eastern Pennsylvania. There, they started making pencils and other writing supplies, which they sold across the United States. Soon after, Edwin turned his attention to chalk markers, which were used in everything from schools to manufacturing. The problem was, they were made from raw chalk, which produced a lot of dust. School teachers were desperate for a better alternative, so he put his mind toward fixing the problem. Eventually, he settled on a composite of slate waste, cement, and talc. When it was shaped and dried, it worked perfectly. That was how Binney and Smith became the purveyor of the world's first dustless white chalk. At the same time, Binney and Smith fixed their focus on another colourful problem. In the early 1900s, crayons were imported from Europe, making them too expensive for many schools. As a result, the crayons that were shipped to the United States were mostly used in industry for making barrels and crates. Edwin and his wife Alice, a former schoolteacher, took the issue seriously. They set about developing a crayon that would be safe enough for children, while also cheap enough to buy for every classroom. They tested several kinds of wax blends. Finally, they settled on a paraffin-based wax, because it left a good amount of residue when marking on paper. They also decided to use non-toxic pigments that were safe for young children. It was Alice who came up with the name for these special new crayons. She called them Crayola, which is a combination of the French word cray for chalk and ola for oleaginous, meaning oily in Latin. The name was printed onto coloured paper, which was then wrapped around each of the 8 crayons in the original box. The first colours were red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, brown, and black. Together, they were branded Crayola Gold Medal School Crayons and sold for a nickel apiece. They were an instant hit when they were released in 1903. Soon, children were brightening up classrooms across America with their colourful drawings. Emboldened by their success, Binney and Smith started selling their crayons in general stores so kids could carry on their colourful etchings at home. Eventually, Binney and Smith crayons became so popular, the company took on their name as its own, and the Crayola Company was born. Over the decades, Crayola added a wide assortment of colours, offering as many as 200 hues in a single box. It has also introduced crayons for professional artists, as well as other products such as paints and marker pens. And of course, they produce hundreds of thousands of wax crayons every day. The process of making crayons is meditative to watch. Wax and colour blend together like a melted rainbow, warm and smooth. Many crayon makers still use paraffin wax as the main material. They melt it and mix it with a fixing powder. As the solution churns in a large, hot vat, they add other ingredients, like stearic acid, to help the wax stick better to paper. Next, they pour in the grains of pigment, which give the crayons their distinctive colours. These granules spiral down into the mix as it turns, blending with all the other components. Then they pump the solution into a large machine. Its surface is made up of thousands of long, thin, crayon-shaped moulds. After the wax fills the moulds, they cover them with cold water. This helps to firm up the wax until it's solid. They use a special blade to remove any excess wax off the top of the moulds, which is then recycled back into new crayons. The hard, finished crayons are then pushed out of the moulds onto a conveyor rack and transported to a labelling machine. From here, they drop one by one into the grooves of a large wheel with a small amount of glue. The crayons roll around until they come to a chamber where a pretty paper label is wrapped onto each one. Then they are transferred to the packaging line, where staff place bundles of crayons into large containers arranged by colour. Machines then select the colours for individual boxes. Eventually, those boxes will end up in the hands of little artists around the world, ready to get to work on their next masterpiece. And as those children sit in front of a blank piece of paper, they have a careful decision to make. What colour should I start with? So, the next time you pick up one of those humble little wax sticks, remember, they really do have a colourful history. Well, that's all for our sleepy journey through history for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you the most pleasant and colourful dreams. Good night.